Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Phil Cohen. I'm the Research Director of Livingmaps, and I've been responsible for putting together this series of events called Frontlines Backyards. So the idea of the events is it's obviously related to the pandemic and the thing we're all living through, but it's devoted really to the proposition that whether we're in the front lines or the backyards, that actually, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is happening actually on the ground. People are kind of responding to the situation, and you know, people who are working, you know, with maps or doing counter mapping or doing various kinds of participatory activities, walks, and so on, have been very active in responding to the situation, and we've brought together people who've been doing this kind of work. So for this third event, I'm delighted really to, and we called it Talking a Walk in the Wild, on the Wild Side. I mean, initially it was Taking a Walk on the Wild Side after the Lou Reed, but actually it was a typo, but I thought actually it made more sense, Talking a Walk on the Wild Side, because actually at the moment it's actually quite hard to do kind of collective walks with people. But we're very lucky that today, this evening, we've got three people who really I think breaking new ground really in how to do walks and how to relate that kind of activity to a whole set of issues around urban democracy or the lack of it, particularly the notions of civic participation, you know, in these very difficult times that we're facing. So how are we going to run it? So we've got three presentations. Each presentation will last about 20 minutes. And then we'll have we have a number of discussants who will, you know, speak for 4 or 5 minutes and you know, raise some issues for further discussion, and then we'll have the discussion lasting about half an hour. So we should finish about 7:45, I think. Now, if so, we're going to run the presentations end on end. If you've got a question or a comment, please use the chat thing. Just you know, type in a question or a comment, and then when we come to this discussion section, I mean, I will sort of monitor that, and obviously either you can unmute yourself and then, you know, say your piece, or if you don't want to do that, then I will, you know, raise the issue that you've typed in. So we'll do it that way. It might be nice. I mean, this is a sort of request to people if they want to do it. I mean, we are recording this session, and it might be nice for that purpose to actually be able to see you. But at least certainly when you if you actually do speak and take part in the discussion, it'd be good not only to unmute yourself but also to let us see you while you're doing it. It's not essential, but it's just a suggestion. Okay. Right. So so our first contributor is Andrew Howe, and Andrew's an interdisciplinary artist. He's based in Shrewsbury. He works solo, but he also works in collaboration with other practitioners and community groups. And he uses walking and mapping to explore how people interact with places. And that's to some extent informed, well, not to some extent, to a large extent informed by his experience over 30 years in engineering and environmental consultancy. And his current practice includes painting, collage, photography, printmaking, books, and digital media. So he's certainly been kept busy in lockdown, I think. So Andrew, over to you for the next 20 minutes.
Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thanks to Phil and the team at Livingmaps for inviting me along to take part in this event. I'm going to talk about the mapping activities I did during the spring and summer this year in Frankwell in Shrewsbury. And there's a certain irony in speaking about it at this particular moment, because at 6 p.m. today, there's a Doorstep Carols event, which if you watch the one show on BBC One last night, you'll know originated in Frankwell, and it's spread across the nation. So if you listen carefully, you might just be able to hear some carols singing in the background as my family and neighbours are all downstairs singing or just sitting on the doorstep. So I'm a walking artist, as Phil mentioned. I work in socially engaged projects, and I generally look for hidden narratives in the layers of history in places. And with the outbreak of the pandemic in March, my usual artist practice was brought to a shuddering halt. 2 ongoing grant applications had to be cancelled, and there was no prospect of working, continuing work in schools and with community groups. Like everyone else, I had to adapt. As I began to come to terms with this, I turned to my daily walks as a mapping process from which several diverse outputs emerged as texts, photographs, drawings, and prints, all gathered into a series of artist books and collaged maps. My burst of spontaneous creativity was not planned from the outset, but as the work evolved, I reached out to other local artists and members of the community to build something that could be defined as a project with a social purpose and longer-term potential. In this talk, I'll briefly discuss 3 different aspects of how my work connected with communities, via sharing on social media, by collective walking, and by a collaborative book or zine making. There was also a 4th aspect, since as a result of being invited by Kimball Bumstead, who I've seen has joined us today, of the Livingmaps network, he asked me to contribute work to the Mapping the Pandemic project, and I made a large collage map of Frankwell as a post-COVID utopia. This map has since been shared by with my local councillor and senior planning officers, part of their ongoing community consultation for the Big Town Plan in Shrewsbury. I talked about this in the previous Livingmaps event, so I won't revisit that now, except to say that you can read about it in Kimball's article in the Livingmaps review, and I think maybe some of those issues will crop up in our discussions. So what was this mapping process? For the first 10 weeks from the start of the lockdown in March until June, I made a record of my daily walks in various media, collecting things and making notes of observations and experiences. And I made sound and video recordings. Normally, I'd try to keep these interruptions to my walking flow to a minimum, so many of the notes were made immediately afterwards. Government rules and guidance on where or when you could walk were not set definitively, so I imposed my own restrictions such that my walks must remain within a 2-kilometre radius of my house. And I also limited myself to not walking every day. Those imposed conditions increased my anticipation of each walk, and exploring within the local boundary became an intense highlight of the week. Having lived in the Frankwell area of Shrewsbury for over 23 years, there were few, if any, places I had not walked in before. But the heightened awareness, the disrupted sense of time and space, meant that I did see details with fresh eyes. My cognitive mapping of the area shifted to a higher level of granular detail, with new areas of focus and an enhanced awareness of spatial and temporal linkages to other times and places. The resulting maps are a patchy, subjective assemblage of personal observations and memory. They may not be reliable to navigate our collective memory of lockdown, but they represent an authentic record that will accord with many others' experience at this time. Initially, I was drawn by curiosity to experience what the world felt like in this new situation and to observe how people were responding. Chance encounters built into new facets to places that I thought I knew well, and this multiplicity of subjectivity generated a continual yearning to look at familiar places in new light. The maps I made documented the human choreography of social distancing entangled with the unfolding of spring. April and May will be remembered for seemingly endless days of perfectly warm sunshine and crystal clear blue skies, not an aircraft trail in sight. Few people that failed to notice the spring this year, as so much time could be spent outdoors listening to birdsong and watching the emergence of seedlings and flowers. Through regular walks, it was possible to pinpoint the day migrating birds arrived or when trees and shrubs came into flower. I noted the day that swifts arrived, only a day or two before they were able to start feasting on the clouds of dancing mayflies emerging from the river. But I also noticed that day was at least a month earlier than the same moment a few years ago, just as I recorded that flowers and leaf budding was similarly occurring earlier, most likely a result of the extraordinary warm weather this year. It's very much apparent that there was a general reawakening of interest in the natural surroundings and environmental impacts. Greater numbers and diversity of people were walking in places where in previous times I rarely saw anyone. The removal of choice to go further afield meant that people began to explore edgelands and wilder green spaces that they might not have ordinarily visited, perhaps even have felt threatened by. Dog walkers and fellow pedestrians passed through thickets and scrub woodland populated in recent times by small encampments of homeless people. This surge of popular interest in surroundings and slowing down offered renewed optimism about future attitudes. More people seem to be reconnecting with the natural world and seeing it as an integral part of their developed environment. My walks usually took place early in the morning when very few people were around. As I went slightly further afield beyond Frankwell, I did occasionally find a new pathway or a road that I had never previously visited. I was conscious that I might be viewed as an intruder, as being a potential asymptomatic virus threat in the quiet residential streets. What was the purpose of my walks? Was I staking some kind of psychological claim over territory? Was I the self-indulgent flaneur? Was it just exercise? I don't think it was any of these particularly, although it was certainly as much a mental exercise as physical, a chance to let my mind breathe in the open air and escape the confines of domesticity. I was keen to record and reflect on how we can find positive roots out of this new situation. I felt a need to connect with others. Against all this familiarity, I was noticing the differences, changes in the natural and built environment, and changes in people's behaviour. Children were making the best of the sunny weather, and chalked pavement drawings and upbeat, hopeful messages were in abundance on every street. Trees became decorated with bunting, ribbons and curious paraphernalia. Boxes and piles of junk appeared at the end of driveways as people found time to sort out their house. Desire paths were worn across verges and patches of grass. Sometimes a parallel line appeared 2 meters from the main path. Oops. In the early stage of the lockdown, I was focused on spending time with family and homeschooling. Whilst helping my daughter Eliza with geography and history, we looked at old Ordnance Survey maps of Frankwell. Frankwell developed in Norman times and grew as a place for free traders outside the jurisdiction of the Lord of the Castle. It became known as a little borough and became an important river port and centre of commercial industrial activity. The River Severn continues to hold a powerful influence on the community. There's an eclectic mix of centuries-old half-timbered buildings, fine villas and lodges, and densely jumbled brick terraces, reflecting a time when much of the housing was cramped and squalid. And more recently, there are modern constructions like the Theatre 7 and University Centre of Shrewsbury. This is where Charles Darwin was born, at Mount House, built by his father Robert Darwin and mother Susanna Wedgwood. And it was here that Charles and his siblings walked daily along a thinking path, where they made their early explorations of the natural world. I can still walk along the river where Darwin walked to Doctor's Field, adjacent to his old home. Eliza and I researched as much about our local history as we could find in books and on the internet. Then, inspired in part by Common Ground's local distinctiveness projects, we created a Frankwell alphabet using images of the letters taken from photographs of local signage. From this, I began creating the first of 5 artist books, an A to Z of Frankwell, with drawings of places for each letter. Some of the drawings refer to old photographs of places since demolished, but mostly I drew what I could see on my walks. The drawings were made in ink, made from oak galls from the tree in our garden. For the next 2 artist books, I arranged photographs into 2 volumes entitled Found in Frankwell. Both books take their inspiration from the love of life reflected in the work of Robert Rauschenberg. I don't know if he would have considered himself a walking artist at the time, but much of his work originates from the findings he made whilst walking, enabling him to conjure drama from the seemingly chaotic juxtaposition of everyday scenes with unexpected encounters. The first volume is a formal study of lines, trajectories and connections, reflecting movement through the urban environment. And the second volume is a freer exploration of texture and light. It's a mapping unrestricted by established rules of ownership and importance. I compiled all of my routes and texts into a single edition book, Walking Territory, using paper made with plant materials gathered from my garden and during the walks. Human actions and voices were recorded as text in the book. I do not use an automated GPS tracking of my walks. Instead, I prefer the ritual of tracing the route on a map after the event, which helps to fix the walk in my memory. Seeing the shape of the route set against mapping topography gave the walks a tangible presence linked to sensory encounters. As I reflected on this, the shape of the walk took on greater importance to me than the scale accuracy. I recorded these shapes using Chinese calligraphy brushes, which allowed more expression in the line, so that each bend and twist triggered memory links with moments from each walk. As I overlaid tracings of my routes, the grain of the town revealed itself with a sinuous loop to the river, first around Frankwell, then the aisle of the town centre, being a dominating influence on the walk terrain. I put my photographs into a grid with 10 columns representing each of the 10 weeks I walked and incorporating my walking routes. The human figure rarely, if ever, featured in my photographs or drawings, but inevitably the camera recorded residual evidence of human activity, all rendered uncanny in the eerie stillness of lockdown. As the weeks passed, the choreography of encounters with other pedestrians evolved. I'm sure you'll all have your experiences of this. As of now, most people are back to not giving this a second thought. In the meantime, physical changes are made to facilitate social distancing by creating new one-way streets, widening footpaths and removing street furniture. This in itself has triggered various local discussions and arguments about access and shifting of traffic. I took part in a walk coordinated remotely by artist Lucy Paris with a group of other walkers via WhatsApp and other online media across the UK and Northern Europe. We're looking specifically at these changes in the urban environment as a result of COVID. Besides the changes to accommodate new queuing arrangements, it was evident that whilst reopening businesses were creating a superficial sense of normality in the town, the public facilities like libraries, public toilets, children's playgrounds, and so on, they remain closed, creating a sense of powerlessness and loss. Like many artists, it's a feature of my artist practice that I share observations and work via social media, and this builds an ongoing conversation with an online community which stretches across the world. For 30 consecutive days in the summer, I participated in Groundwork Gallery's Doorstep Environment Challenge to post images in response to keywords each day. One of the themes of my post, which attracted popular attention, was the plethora of found paintings and collages on the backs of road signs, in the lichens on ancient walls, and scratches and rust on battered garage doors and skips. All were discoveries from my walks into what I termed the urbane gallery, viewing the environment as a gallery of contemporary art. It's not a widely original idea, but I was really taken with being more playful with it from a guided sculpture trail walk that was led by Graham Morell and others a couple of years ago in Huddersfield. So I often attach a formal critique to my image posts as if this were an actual piece of work from an obscure international artist on residency. And judging by the response I get to this, it really does seem to transform how people view their environment. So you might remember that back in February, Shrewsbury was in the national news due to the devastating impact of flooding. The River Severn very nearly reached record-breaking levels twice in the space of several weeks. People throughout the town were still trying to pick up the pieces for their businesses and homes when the pandemic hit. From an early stage of my mapping process, therefore, I sensed an opportunity, or rather a need, to help bring the local community together, support local businesses and celebrate where we live. I contacted some of the artists I know living in or connected with Frankwell to invite them to collaborate. Many expressed support, and 6 artists joined me to create a collaborative book titled Frankwell in View. We were supported with a small bursary from Raven Studios, a local community arts studio. book comprised prints, drawings and photography and digital work, reflecting Frankwell's heritage and its green spaces, which had been so valuable to us during the lockdown. Sales of the book in the town have helped rejuvenate community interest and raise some money for a local environmental charity, the Shrewsbury Food Hub. And interesting, that's one of the charities that the Carols service tonight is supporting as well. Building on this, we have plans for some public events, including an urban sketching day, also involving a local cafe and businesses, and an exhibition to extend our mapping through collective artworks. Further COVID restrictions meant that we've had to postpone those plans, but for several weeks, the book and some fabulous prints by one of the artists, Jancis Vaughan, were on display in a framing studio in the main street through Frankwell. Here's some of the work from other artists involved, and it's not all black and white in the book. As you can see from the quotes, the project provided a bit of a lift, and even if only in a small way, the books raised interest and pride in what the community has to offer. There's an ongoing consultation into developing Frankwell and other areas of Shrewsbury, so this is a contribution to that debate about what it is that defines a character and identity of the area. Since that period of mapping, I've become busy with other projects, and when the second lockdown was imposed during November, I was less inclined to go wandering as before. It was not so much the darker, colder weather. Normally I'd revel in that. No, now the atmosphere is totally different. I feel apprehensive and disenchanted with the outside world in a way I never felt previously. Could this be a delayed or cumulative effect of the pandemic on my state of mind? Perhaps this highlights just how unique that first period of lockdown was. The mapping I did in various forms cannot capture the myriad of personal stories of the residents stuck in their homes in my local community during an unprecedented time. It's a selective visual record of embodied knowledge found through walking. Glimpses are offered through a series of portals into phenomenological experiences that only I can recall from personal memory. Fellow local residents will no doubt have shared similar experiences, and the maps could establish a longer-term meaning, drawing on a collective memory. Perhaps in this way, the maps will resonate with many other people further afield who have walked their territory under lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's a fantastic contribution. I'm sure it will have a big impact, and it's a very timely and imaginative response to lockdown. And I think certainly in the discussion, the way you address the iconography of lockdown and its implications for understanding how people make sense of the city. And in a way that kind of leads on to our next contributor, Julie Pichon, who's an urban planner and a designer, and actually works for the London Islington in their design and city planning department. And she's, as part of her work, she is, I think she's technical title is Inclusive Design Officer, but she's also involved in walking and cycling, managing walking and cycling projects, and I think been involved in what became quite a controversial scheme in Islington to reroute traffic so that you had kind of pedestrian-free zones and so on. She's a passionate and committed traveler, and she's interested in the whole notion of sustainable and inclusive cities. As part of that, she coordinates the Young Urbanist Network for the Academy of Urbanism, and in her free time, which I don't suppose she has much of these days, but in her free time, she tries to improve cycling conditions, working with the London Cycling Campaign. And this evening, she's going to talk to us about her empathy walks. So, Julie.
Thank you, Phil. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see this?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just get started. So thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm going to be talking about a project called Empathy Walks, and I'll try to recontextualize it a bit in the context of the pandemic and the challenges that it brings about. So as Phil said, I'm a town planner and an urban designer. So the way, obviously, planning is done very often is top down. In terms of mapping, the maps we create, they tend to be quite technical as well, based on data and kind of like, they could be defined in many ways as what you could say is, defined as cold maps, essentially technical and so on. So acknowledging that urbanism can be that technical and cold discipline, the ambition for the project initially was to look at the city and placemaking as a delicate, invisible, horizontal process shaped by people, not just shaped by planners, obviously. So the concept of Empathy Walks is it's an open source project which aims to build empathy through walking each other's everyday and banal paths, to build empathy and understanding among citizens. The idea is to unlock narratives and open a space for diverse voices to be heard, making citizens more aware of each other's perspectives and presence. And obviously, it also aims at creating these empathic maps, which I think distinguish themselves from the kind of traditional planning maps. So the team, just very quickly, we graduated in 2016 from the Bartlett School of Planning at UCL, came from all over the world, but what united us obviously was the belief that cities are created by everyone and for everyone, and that we should plan for more inclusive cities. And acknowledging again that planning can affect people's lives. Just on empathy, what is empathy? What is this word, and how does it contrast from the notion of sympathy? So actually in English, it's quite a relatively new term. It was first coined in 1909, translated from German. From the 1930s, it was described as taking the role of other people to understand their situation. So it's both a cognitive and an affective process. It means being aware of the presence of other people, perceive them, care for them without judging and with respect. It builds bridges between strangers with no other expectation than understanding, nurture careful awareness, and trigger identification. Going back to maps now, I think that the real idea is that, a map is never unbiased. The way we represent the different elements of the built environments always have a meaning. Here I've just illustrated this with a Charles Booth Victorian a map illustrating the levels of poverty in London, which massively influenced the way that London was planned in the Victorian era. So maps, as traditionally used in city planning, are built by layers that depict different structures of the urban fabric, streets, open spaces, land uses, etc. Urban maps are tools to narrate the division between different urban elements and socioeconomic differences. As abstract representation, traditional maps leave an open door for important and meaningful information about citizens and communities to be lost, with the pitfall of failing to capture the richness and complexity of urban diversity and temporal change. The choices made in constructing traditional maps often fail to register the experiences and value generated by different groups who use the same city, but in different ways. The lack of depth of mapping made Empathy Walk consider how alternative mapping can provide a platform for people to be heard and stimulate a reflection on social issues as well. Henri Lefebvre defined that the production of spaces is composed by a triad of layers: lived, conceived, and perceived. Mainstream maps really cover the representation of conceived spaces, which is basically how they look physically, failing to translate how they are perceived and lived by different people or groups who would interact with these spaces in different and personal ways. on the same idea. Feminist planner, planning academic Fran Tonke synthesized that if the official order for the city is written down as so many rules, codes, maps, and plans, the individual's version is a spatial story told as if out loud in the streets of the city, leaving no trace other than a movement in the air. I think it's quite interesting, this notion of invisibilizing voices. So Empathy Works is about trying to trace back and make visible the invisible movement of people and support inclusive planning. Just a very kind of quick point on big data, because I think that's something that is definitely concerning. I mean, personally, it worries me a lot that we seem to be overly reliant and ever more reliant on big data, which are automatically generated data sets, which inform what we think we know of cities, and obviously inform planning decisions as if that data was unbiased because it's automatically generated. But again, it comes back to this idea that a map is never unbiased. And I think it's the same thing with data, and data is never impartial. So bearing that in mind, if data is unbiased, if data isn't unbiased, narratives obviously are not biased either. But why not mixing the two? I think on the other hand, on a more kind of positive note, the democratization of the ownership of data is an opportunity for communities to take control of their own story, voicing narratives that have the power to shape local processes in specific and wanted direction. So the idea of Empathy Works in that way, I guess, is to kind of humanize urban data, give a face and a bit of a personality to urban knowledge, I guess. We also know that storytelling is such a powerful tool to access narratives and guide urban transformations. How space is perceived will massively influence the way it's treated through planning. And the story of how a place is narrated is very often driven again by either developers or local authorities. So what if it's citizen-led? What can it change about that narrative, and how can it influence regeneration projects, for instance? That takes me very quickly to The Ladder of Participation by Sherry Hanstein, a wonderful, I think it's a really wonderful way of looking at participation in society, and it applies so well to the built environment and planning. So the two bottom layers levels are the levels of non-participation, which is therapy and manipulation, when we kind of cure people for a project, or we just educate them about understanding the project, for instance. Then the levels in the middle are tokenism, level of participation. So you inform, you do consultation. Placation is a quite interesting level where you pick some citizens and you put them, for instance, in advisory boards. But again, they're advisors rather than decision makers. I think in general, the built environment uses these three levels of tokenism in participation quite, it's just quite well established. And the upper levels are the levels of citizen power, so partnership, delegated power, and citizen control is really the highest point, and it's about controlling the narrative. And I think this is why I like to think that Empathy Works is somewhere up there within the citizen control of participation. Before developing the methodology for Empathy Works, we worked on sensorial maps, and it was inspired by the Jane Jacobs walk. So they're sensory walks. You give participants a set of icons, and you ask them to really explore the area, for instance, with their smell, their eyes. So you can give them different types of exercises that they have to fill in. And that's kind of like how the idea of Empathy Works as well emerges from doing these kind of sensorial walks. So the toolkit to organize an empathy walk is quite simple, really. 6 very simple steps. The first one is that you identify a walk leader. you make the invitation to create an empathy walk. The second one, you interact with the walk leader, listen to their story, to identify their main needs and concerns in their relationship with the city. Step 3, you design the walking route in a way that captures the essence of the walk leader's needs. And then you set up a time, an event, you invite participants, and you just kind of communicate around it. Step 5 is document the walk and create these empathy maps, which I'm going to show you in a bit. And step 6 is to share the knowledge and to generate a discussion on the topic proposed by the walk. So I'm just going to illustrate with 2 of the walks we've done. The first one was in July 2017. It was called There's Nothing Here. It was in King's Cross. It was led by someone called Christian, who works in the industrial estate of Camley. It's the Camley Street Industrial Estate, just north of King's Cross. And the name of the walk came from the fact that the area was designated as brownfield land, kind of ripe for development, and that it sits really, really close to quite a swanky development around Granary Square with some, lovely market housing and so on. And when Christian, who was working in the industrial estate around the corner, went to visit, and he went to the kind of, real estate little office where they sell the flats, and said, I just work over there. And the estate agent's reaction was, but there's nothing there. As if really this space was just disused, ready for change. So we had a walk around that industrial estate, and it was really interesting to discover the many activities going on there, and also to have participants who walked in the area, lived in the area. They were coming from the area and had never been to that industrial estate, and feeling genuinely surprised about discovering so many so many uses and activities. So this is an example of the icons that we gave to participants. We gave them like paper maps. We told them, you can annotate with the icons. You can also write your comments. We gave them a feedback form. So that's the kind of that's what like an empathy walk map looks like at the end. We kind of collate all the different icons, and you can kind of get a sense of how the narrative from the walk leader influences the perception of the area. The second walk we organized, we organized many more, but that's an example for tonight, is November 2018. We organized a walk in South Kilburn in northwest London, led by someone called Leslie and Dee, who managed the Grenville Community Kitchen, which is a community project. And the context for that walk is a council estate that's under regeneration. The council has quite expensive plans to comprehensively regenerate the estate, which means that quite a lot of demolition, and the nature of the estate changing quite radically very, very quickly. When we visited the estate, a lot of things were shut. There used to be a row of community shops, very affordable. These were all kind of boarded up, and it was announced that Marks and Spencer would replace them, for instance. So, it was very, very contested space. And that's again like an example of a participant map. That's the paper map. And you can see again, like here, that person decided just to annotate what they were thinking. So you can say, beautiful views, cold and damp, despair, sadness. There were also, that's another example of someone who actually made some more use of the icons. So for instance, like trying to protect the park, the Pill Precinct, which was where the shops were, the fact that it's locked, so because it's all boarded up and it's just awaiting change. So I'm getting towards the end of this presentation, but I think that the value of empathy walks is that it can unlock narratives, it values local knowledge, democratizes urban design to a certain extent, because people know their community, they know the neighborhood, but they don't necessarily make the connection with the urban design that defines, that really represents the backdrop of their life. And that's a way of empowering people to reconsider planning in a more approachable way. It unveils as well hidden places of social value, connects also groups and organizations. Just as an anecdote, when we had the South Kilburn walk, there was an academic professor from UCL on the walk, and he then connected with the walk leader to work on a community plan with a financial, with a viability assessment to come up with an alternative for the regeneration of the estate. So it was really the opportunity for people with different skills to meet and build that community capacity as well. I think that was a really positive outcome from the walk. So what works well with this methodology, I think, is really small size groups. You can't just scale it up. You can't have, do mass empathy walks. It works in like small groups that allow a good level of interaction. It must be quite informal. It works as well because of, I think, the element of citizen control, skills sharing, community building. The limitations of the methodology, I think it's the annotations. We could rework the icons, we could make them evolve, but we need the icons to compare the maps, because we can't just compare annotations on the map. So they're quite helpful in that respect. Digitization, I think, is one key element that we haven't explored yet, and also accessible formats for people, for instance, with complex mobility needs that may not be able to join us on the walks. How can we make the walks come to them? So conclusion, and something about COVID-19 as well. But I think the question of inclusion has come into sharper focus with this COVID-19 pandemic, which has made more visible socioeconomic disparities and how social and spatial inequalities affect people's ability to access essential services. On the one hand, we've seen this notion of new key workers. It's given a name to the modern working class, people working in the essential social and health services, delivery drivers, people whose work involves the everyday maintenance of the city, and who could not therefore stop their work or stay at home. And one's health and employment status, living situation, and access to computers and to the internet, for example, has defined the level of comfort and ability to access essential services during the pandemic. So we've seen, I think, new redefinitions of exclusion. I think digital exclusion has been a big one. And I don't have the answer yet on how the walks can address that, but I think it's quite an interesting development we can think about. So my final question, I guess, is, can a map be a leveling tool for city planning? Can they represent the contested nature of places? And the kind of answer, but I will also open it to the floor, obviously, is that we believe that mapping process can democratize city planning and plant the seed for new ways for citizens to consider each other's presence. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much. That was great. And as you say, that question at the end, I think, is something we can pick up in the discussion, and also kind of refers back to some of the issues raised in Andrew's presentation. So our third speaker tonight is Lucy Frears, and Lucy is a lecturer in the School of Film and Television at Falmouth University. And her research is practice-based, focusing on located media and including immersive sound, memory work, and phenomenology and intangible heritage. So the notion of intangible heritage is certainly something that interests us at Livingmaps. We're actually developing a multimedia walk around Olympic Park, and you can't see much of the heritage of the park there. So I'm really looking forward to Lucy's presentation. So over to Lucy.
Okay, hello. I'll just share my screen. There, so you should all be able to see my slide. Yeah. So just trying to get rid of, okay. Thanks very much, Phil Cohen and all at Livingmaps for inviting me here. And thank you to all the other speakers before me, Andrew and Julie. And it's really heartwarming for me to see some familiar faces and names here today, but also rather terrifying. So thank you all very much for coming. I'm here because my DeepMap app reference tool is now available as a download from the most recent Livingmaps journal issue, number 9. And I'll post that link and other links mentioned in the presentation in the chat after the talk so that you can get the info before you leave. Now, I've got some words on the screen by artist and theatre director Clifford McLucas, who will be mentioned a few times during the talk. But I just wanted to use it as a way to frame why DeepMaps differ from what he describes here as conventional cartography. So DeepMaps can be politicized and passionate. They involve contested ideas over who and what is represented and how, and prompt debate about their portrayal of people and places. So DeepMaps should engage, as McLucas says, the insider and outsider. So basically, my reference tool is, I hope, an accessible guide to check through when planning, commissioning, making and sharing work that I describe as locative media. So that's GPS triggered media through apps or MP3 sound walks. The reference tool or guide was made after experimenting and making apps, working through various iterations after gathering feedback and reflecting. And there was also field work. I tried out numerous apps and walking sound experiences made by others. So artists, geographers, historians, I can see Toby Butler's here with us today, and those used for tourism. And of course, there's desk work, so there's research behind it. I want the reference tool to be used by anybody, really. So artists, community groups, practicing academics, as in academics that make practice, app commissioners such as charities and students. And so the language and layout reflects that wide sort of hopefully appeal. I'm keen for others to make locative media experiences as, in my opinion, they provide an opportunity for a genuinely polyphonic approach to storying place that, says Clifford McLucas, will bring together the amateur and the professional, the artist and the scientist, the official and the unofficial, the national and the local. So to give some context, DeepMap is mentioned in the rather clumsy title of the reference tool because I'm intrigued and inspired by deep mapping developed by writer and performer Mike Pearson, archaeologist Michael Shanks, and artist and theatre director Clifford McLucas. Now, they were all colleagues developing large-scale site-specific performances by Welsh theatre company Brif Goth. And they were inspired to explore and develop their own ideas of deep mapping by William Least Heat Moon, whose dense book, Prairie Earth, A Deep Map, was published in 1991. Now, Heat Moon describes himself as a secretary of underlife, as he revealed hidden narratives of place. And what I really like about deep mapping is its use of all kinds of remnants of traces of information from multiple sources so that multiple voices are heard. And these are obviously official records, but also gossip and stories that have been overlooked, ignored, or even suppressed. Unfortunately, Clifford McLucas died in 2002 before all his ideas were realised or documented fully. Pearson and Shanks say in their book, Theatre Archaeology, that deep maps are the conflation of oral testimony, anthology, memoir, biography, natural history, and everything you might ever want to say about a place. And they go on to say that reflecting 18th century antiquarian approaches to place, which included history, folklore, natural history, and hearsay, the deep map attempts to record and represent the grain and patina of place through juxtapositions and interpretations of the historical and the contemporary, the political and the poetic, the factual and the fictional, the discursive and the sensual. And these are proactive documents. Their parts do not necessarily cohere. They'll require work, but they leave space for the imagination of the reader or whoever's taking them in. At that point, it was all about people reading it. So the interpretive instinct is not denied, meaning is not monopolized. And as such, deep maps may function as an alternative kind of site report. So before he died, Clifford McLucas experimented with digital media and deep mapping to overlap and layer information. Now he, for example, used images on sort of transparent or tracing paper to uncover the layered histories and impressions of place. And you could fold back one layer after another to reveal the bits underneath and so on. And he was doing this before smartphones, and never mind smartphones and GPS existed. So located media seemed to me an exciting new way of bringing McLucas, Pearson and Shank's explorations and ideas around deep mapping together using a new platform. So I mapped audio stories and images onto specific locations using GPS. So with locative media, cartography is brought back into this mapping process, but there are just many more opportunities to add numerous more layers than a conventional map can cope with. So when a point is made on a map using locative media, many stories can be pinned to that spot. These can be memories from different periods, histories that reach right back to mythology or legends, or they can even reach into sort of future imaginings of place. So our experience of the map then becomes three-dimensional, and in fact, I would say four-dimensional, with the fourth dimension being time. So instead of this bird's eye view that we see here, the usual perspective of a place on a map, a much richer, layered stratigraphy of place is experienced. No, actually embodied as we walk through it using deep mapping. So past the surface, we can go in deep to experience, as McLucas says, a range of different media or registers in a sophisticated and multi-layered orchestration. And the work produced can have many more layers added to it later on. So it remains, as McLucas says again, open and unfinished. So that's a hint of the background, the context of the name of my Deep Map app reference tool, a guide to making locative media work. And an intention behind it is to encourage you to make work that helps us all to have access to the messy, textured, polyvocal histories of place that Black Lives Matter has forced us all to take responsibility to notice, to make heard, and to share. So, the reference tool. As you can download it for free, I won't go into it in depth. I'll just give you an idea of what's in it. So making a deep map app is a performative mapping practice or creative cartography as described in the introduction to this event. And in the reference tool, there are fieldwork suggestions, how to get to know the area, for example, which includes tips on how to interview people. Now, Joe Reed says it's better to interview people at the site. And Reed is a founder of Calvium who made the app making tool, App Furnace, that I and many other artists and creatives use to make located media apps. She and Richard Hull, plus former colleagues Phil Stenton and Eric Heelgood, have a deep knowledge of research and practice in this area. Anyway, back to interviewing. Sometimes, because of the age and fragility of interviewees, it's hard to do interviews on site. But whether you can or can't, I recommend that you try to get interviewees to use the present tense and to describe what they can see, meaning to describe it as it was, that is at the time of their memory. Sorry, it sounds a bit confusing. So is to try and describe it as they can see it when they're telling the time they're telling their story. So this really helps us make a strong connection with the past and stops the work being completely sort of sepia and over nostalgic, because instead it feels current. The present tense is about now. And if memories include objects or buildings still visible in the landscape, then encourage interviewees to mention them. My research showed that these moments when the listener walk a participant, as Misha Myers describes them, walk up some steps, for example, that are mentioned in a story, there's a meaningful connection with that place and the past that takes place. So also in the reference tool, there are practical tips, such as standard interview techniques. Most being ignored, I have to say, in this image here, but the main objective was intergenerational sharing of stories there. And I'm sure when the pupils heard the recordings, they realized what they needed to do next time. And so sometimes we learn by making mistakes. And the reference tool is basically to try and help you minimize the amount of your mistakes. So some quick recording tips are to use headphones, so earbuds let in too much environmental sound. So it's best to use the less subtle over the ear closed cup headphones. Remember, your headphone level is not the sound level that the interview is being recorded at. And many recorders have automatic level settings, so that's helpful. But if your level goes into the red, it can become unusable. So just gently move the mic away a bit from the person's mouth and then move it back in when they calm down a bit. Because people tend to speak at a different level when they're actually talking about what they feel passionate about than when you are there sort of testing the levels and setting things before you set up. So a tip is often just to bring the level slightly down, being aware that that'll probably happen. And then other things are use a windshield or pop screen. And so if you're outside in the wind, use something like this so that the mic doesn't hit the recorder and ruin the recording or disturb the recording. And be careful that all your cables and so on aren't rustling and banging against the recorder as well. And aim at this sort of throat area so that all the plosive P's and so on don't all go straight into the microphone. And a really good thing to do is just to keep eye contact and nod. So this is a really good tip because it has two advantages. One is it stops people that you're interviewing fixating on the microphone right in front of them and getting rather nervous. And it also stops you from feeling you have to say things like, yeah, oh yeah, I understand, which often ruins the recordings. So they're just some practical tips and things that are, obviously there are more in the actual reference tool. So to make located media work, for example, like Graham Miller's linked, there are other pointers in the reference tool. So future-proofing is one of these, and that's in regard to changes in the site and the technology. And then the planning section goes over things such as what skills are needed for a good app. So one person, the maker, might be really good at doing interviews, finding people, composing music, you know, writing funding applications, all the rest of it. But if not, you need to find those skills, you know, so somebody who can be proactive in the community to find good people and on social media and so on, can interview people, can commission and articulate what they need to composers, graphic designers, and super important for apps, coders, and are comfortable with giving all of them the information that's needed in the right kind of files and so on. And then there's the stuff like PR, applying for funding, reporting for funding, proofreading, risk assessments, copyright agreements on how interviews, recordings and photos so on need to be completed. But I'm making it seem really boring, and it's not, because then of course there's the interesting bit, and that's the content that involves recording, audio, editing, mixing. And it's good, for example, to record sounds heard naturally in the environment. So down here where I am in Cornwall, that's seagulls. This means that your recorded soundtrack or soundscape merges with the real environmental sounds in place, which makes it much more immersive. But also be careful with reoccurring sounds that make it clear that a background soundscape, for example, is actually a repeating loop. So a dog bark, for example, was removed from the piece Riot in Bristol after complaints from participants. And in my Hail Chirks app, I used 2 loops of 15 minutes, one of music and one was a soundscape, and they faded in imperceptibly between the story clips to try and make it all feel like one smooth experience. And you can also play with recorded environmental sound by having very different sounds from a very different environment from the one the participant is moving and is seeing, or different weather than the one that the participant is experiencing, which has an interesting effect. And so I recommend recording at the site in all sorts of weathers and at different times of the day, because the morning sounds very different to the middle of the night. Another thing to think about is experience with binaural mics and binaural recording, because binaural sound puts the listener into a 360-degree bubble of sound, which is much more immersive for the listener than stereo sound, which is basically, you basically hear what's from your ears forwards. A binaural recording, as you can see in the image on the screen, records the sounds from above and behind you, and you can see, and this has an incredible effect on the listener. It makes the digital recording hyper real, but also you can do things with the listener. For example, usually if we hear a noise behind us, we turn around, and these moments can be used to move, surprise, and in some pieces of work, scare participants. I'm not saying you should definitely do that, but some people do. But they're like tricks in the circus that if you use them too much, they become less powerful. So in this image from the theatre company Complicité's performance, The Encounter, the dummy head has binaural microphones in each ear, and basically they look like this. So you usually put them in a dummy head. You can put them in your own ears because it's recording that distance from your, of an actual real head. And when we listen back, we hear everything in this 360 pattern that I showed you a minute ago. In my introduction to the reference tool on the Livingmaps site, there's more information on how the way the script or interview is recorded and how the way the narration, for example, is performed affects the listener. And so there's more you can look up there, but I'll give you an example. So to create the most immersive experience when recording a scripted personal narrative, as artist Janet Cardiff often does, the 2 binaural mics are in the ears of the dummy head. So for example, you can see the dummy head in that image. But instead of being where Simon McBurnley is in that image, you go right behind the head, basically so that you're speaking to the back of the dummy head. So the microphones are in the ear of the dummy head and you're speaking behind it. So when that recording is listened to afterwards, the headphones, with headphones, it has the uncanny feeling of sounding like it's your own subconscious voice speaking inside your own head. And then if someone else listens to my voice recorded like that, for example, it sounds like their subconscious voice talking inside their head. So this embodiment of the speaker by the listener creates a physical, mental, and emotional involvement by the participant in the story and really makes a difference. So do think about the experience you want the participant to have, as it will affect how you plan, record, and make the piece. So at the end of the reference tool, you'll find pointers to examples of best practice, such as by Terry Rubes, by Terry Rube, and images from her work and website are shown here on the screen. And I recommend others that I've mentioned in this presentation, such as Janet Cardiff and George Burris Miller, Duncan Speakman and Graham Miller. And they all have extensive experience and have a lot of innovation in this area. But more people are getting intrigued in this sort of physical cinema, as Cardiff refers to it. So keep your ears and eyes open for other people. The Pervasive Media Cookbook is mentioned as a resource, and like I said, I'll try and put it in the links and in the chat, sorry. And I also want to mention a new resource, which is last year, artist Duncan Speakman created No Vantage Point, Reflections, Provocations and Experiments in Immersion, which is very useful. So that's my mix of influences and intentions and snapshots of what is in the reference tool that's behind this deep map app reference tool. So it's probably just best if you read it and take the bits that are useful to you. But thank you very much for listening.
Right. Thank you so much, Lucia. Thank you for drawing our attention to the work of Clifford McLucas. I certainly didn't know about, and we'll try and follow up, and also for your very, thorough presentation of the apps. And as Lucy says, it's available on our current issue number 9 of our journal, and in fact the other 2 contributors also have contributed to the journal. So it's a plug for the journal, and for people who are working in this field, you have a look at the journal, and we're always looking for new contributions, particularly people who are doing kind of, new work to talk about it. So that's just a plug for the journal. Well, our 3 contributors are really, they're both, all the contributors have made very rich presentations, which raise a lot of questions and a lot of issues, which we now want to explore. And we thought as a way of kind of structuring the conversation, we'd ask 2 of our living mappers to give a kind of response for 5 or 6 minutes to the presentations. So perhaps we'll start with Claire, Claire Qualman, who's one of the leading lights, I think, founder of the Walking Artists Network, and also edits along with Blake Morris one of the sections of our journal. So Claire, are you there? Can you come in and maybe give us?
Hello everyone. Thanks, Phil, and thank you so much to all our speakers. That was brilliant. Thanks, Andrew, Julie, and Lucy. So I'm really going to make a kind of spontaneous rather than a prepared response, even though I have had a kind of advanced view of each of the contributors' papers from the journal that's just recently come out. And I think I want to begin by thinking about kind of 3 terms that the 3 speakers touched on that I was struck by. So Andrew, just to begin with, kind of thinking about the way you discussed a choreography of encounters really struck me as a kind of really engaging turn of phrase for thinking about the shifting space that we're operating in, and how your kind of personal process of repeated walking, a kind of iterative process of walking through a space that was your familiar but was being seen in a new light, kind of might reflect on the way that pedestrian movement is adjusted in this kind of extreme moment, but also thinking about how processes of mapping, as your work started to kind of unfold and connect more with communities, to move away from a kind of individual creative practice and to become more connected with other people, how that might work to develop connections and shared understandings of place and space in the light of the changes both that the people were experiencing, but also that the places and spaces were experiencing in the pandemic. And it's possible there's a question in there somewhere loosely that maybe we can come back to in a minute. Then Julie, in Julie's presentation, I was really struck by the idea of sensorial engagement. And I suppose the idea that normally maps, what we think of as maps and mapping, is presented in a very two-dimensional, well, sometimes three-dimensional, but a very kind of restricted format. So we take the kind of smelly, noisy, textured reality, and it's transformed into something very graphic and and representational, but only in a very particular way, so that many of our senses in normal mapping are kind of ignored. And so again, I was really struck by that idea of, well, of participation, I suppose, and of mapping as process rather than maps as product. And that applies, I guess, actually in all three of the presentations, is that really thinking about participation, methods and processes for engaging with people in mapping as an activity rather than thinking about mapping as an endpoint is where the kind of power is within this. Then in Lucy's work, I was really struck by a term that you used, Lucy, of immersive flux, of an idea of moving in between embodiment and immersion when you're using GPS triggered experiences that relate to whatever media, so that the people who are using these apps, but I imagine as well people who are using your toolkit to create them, are kind of switching modes in between the very sighted bodily experience of being in a place and the layering of the media sources that they want to bring in that. So, and I found that really exciting to kind of think about, both in terms of the technological possibilities, but actually again as an idea of process rather than product. So I think it's really exciting, and I'm lucky enough to have experienced Lucy's Hale Chirks app in person, which is a really amazing experience. If you ever find yourself in Hale in Cornwall, I recommend doing it. But I'm excited to see that work kind of developing into a toolkit for use by other people, because I think that opens up a whole new realm of potential for engaging people. So yes, that's my kind of spontaneous reflection and response. And I suppose within that, maybe there's a question for all of the speakers around how you think about mapping as process rather than a map as a product. But we can hold that until
it's a bit of a chestnut, that one, isn't it? Yeah. So, well, there's three very quite substantial questions there. So, shall we? Would Andrew and Lucy and Julie like to respond to that, and then we'll move to the next discussion?
Well, shall I start?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I do think of mapping as a process rather than having to reach an endpoint. That, you know, the use of a map is perhaps in articulating people's sense of their environment rather than it being used, you know, have a quite narrow use as a navigation tool. Obviously that is also useful, but if we're wanting to engage people and get responses to what they think about the space around them, I think there needs to be some sort of process that people can get engaged with and to feel that they can participate in that. And to give something very personal. I don't know whether we want to stick on that subject, but you were talking about the choreography of pedestrian encounters, and I think that's part of that process, that I became hyper aware of the proximity of people or the presence of people, and that also at the same time the physical environment was changing to accommodate this social distancing, and so there was this strange movement of the physical space and also the people encountering that space, and people were having particular reactions to that and reactions to my presence and the presence of other people, and I was aware of this strange, you know, dance of people in this space. Quite enjoyable seeing that evolve until people became quite passive aggressive about it. Some people were determined to ignore all that and to actually just rigidly walk towards you, which in itself was quite interesting. But yeah, it transformed the environment and how I thought about it, and therefore how I would map that in a way that I hadn't encountered at all before the pandemic.
Thank you. Julia, do you want to
Yes,
respond?
I think, I think, you know, for empathy walks, obviously the product of the map gives us an indication as to whether the narrative from the walk leader has influenced people's perception, which is a really important thing. But I see the value of the walk also in terms of empowering the walk leader to, you know, tell the story, reappropriate their environment, getting people around, getting people to talk about a place, which doesn't even have any kind of wider context other than what the person in front of us is saying. So for me, it's this process of getting together and creating the walk with one person. That's really, really valuable. Obviously, we have a product because of people, you know, annotating the maps and so on. But I really see, I mean, the best things that I've seen coming out of empathy walks have been people telling us that they never get to practice their public speaking skills, and that's really helped them feeling more confident. And then other people actually exchanging details and seeing how they can work together on a new project or collaborate on X, Y, and Z. So yes, I'd say like the process value is almost what I cherish more than the end product, I think.
Right, thank you. Lucy.
Yeah, so yeah, sort of the immersive flux is sort of works with dual embodiment. So that's embodiment in the place where you are and embodiment in the digital story you're listening to. And so, and this sort of what I describe as immersive flux is this flicking, this movement of immersion in either place, because even though you can sort of be embodied in both, it's very hard to be immersed in the place where you are and immersed in a story at the same time. So that kind of maybe gives a little bit about that. In regards to the process, you know, that's an interesting one, because it's a very, yes, the process is incredibly interesting, and obviously the experience that people have through the app is very different from actually the process, you know, that obviously takes a lot longer of making it. So you've got the walking the route multiple times over, you know, recording and so on, months or whatever. You know, you can do it in different time frames, but for me, because I was doing lots of research about it, it was over months. And meanwhile, what I did say was it was in an area that was being sort of gentrified, and so I mean, a motivation behind the whole thing was to make sure that the sort of memory of the place, which was much grubbier, it was quite, you know, industrial, and you know, was kept there despite it all turning into sort of swanky apartments. And so the process is great because basically you embody the whole thing. You walk alone recording or whatever, you walk with people, interview people while recording, talking about, of course, pre-COVID times. You know, I interview also people in their houses, and that's a whole kind of memory and experience for me and them. And so, yeah, actually, you've made me think that potentially thinking and reflecting on that process of map making with located media is actually would be really rich to kind of think about, because you're right, you know, because, well, for various reasons I had to produce something. I had funding, for example, from Heritage Lottery, then called Heritage Lottery Fund. So yeah, no, that's an interesting thing, and I'm really thankful, Claire, that you've mentioned that. It's going to make me think more about the process, because it is really good.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay. All right, so now I'd like to introduce our second discussant, Jacob Wallet. Jacob, I'm delighted to say, has just joined our advisory group. He manages our website and the whole kind of social media that we do. And he did a very interesting piece in the current issue of the journal as well.
with an artist from Amsterdam. We'd made an atlas, and I think that involved also a piece of walking with the two of them. So Jacob, have you got some thoughts, comments on the presentations?
Yes, I've written lots of very nebulous notes, so I'll try and bring it a bit together. I think I'll go through them one by one. So for Andrew, I thought I really loved your presentation. I think you managed to bring together a practice that seems to go in scale from the size of the scale of rivers to the scale of virus proteins, which is a pretty amazing landscape to be dealing with. I thought that was very interesting. And I kind of felt Darwin haunting certain bits of that. I really liked your focusing on sort of lines of flight as opposed to destinations, because for me in this pandemic, that's certainly how I feel about my sort of new conception of where nature might be. That the virus doesn't, bears no real relation to us as a living thing, as a body, because it's on the very edge of what might be alive. But in interaction with our networks and relations, then there's this emergent kind of something like agency. So I found that very interesting. And I found it interesting to see that alongside Julie's presentation, because almost we have the opposite perspective, that the human scale and the human body in the place is the really crucial thing for a map, the defining thing for a map. So I thought that was interesting, not a contradiction, but a sort of discussion somehow between those. Sorry, just check my notes. Yeah, so we have this, what seems like a very interesting discussion between different ways of humanizing maps, I would say, by the removal of the scale of the body or the insistence on it. And most of my questions were for Lucy. I'd really like to know what's for you the real value of being, should we say, an ear witness rather than an eyewitness? Because I feel like there's something very special about the human voice, which is very different to images. Certainly that it's sort of already bodily and embodied somehow when we hear it. I mean, the binaural effect is very powerful in enhancing that, but even without it, it's hard to hear a voice without hearing a body. So I'm interested in why the voice for you is so vital in immersion. And I also wanted to know your thoughts on whether it's useful to make some distinction between immersion and engagement, because immersion is a bit slippery, because some things can be very immersive, but also very alienating. For example, smartphones, they're very immersive, but you might get hit by a bus while you're looking at one. So it's a bit strange. It's immersive, but it's not always clear what it immerses you in. So yes, I was wondering if for you if this flux is between immersion and engagement, perhaps. That's my bit.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Jacob, for really interesting questions there. So should we take them in reverse order? Lucy, do you want to start off then?
Okay. Thank you very much, Jacob. So one thing I wanted to say, because you were talking about, before I answer your questions, because you were talking about putting the body back into maps, and that's also something that Clifford McLucas, the artist theatre director, also wanted to put the body back in the map, and that's what I felt locative media did. So, about being an ear witness. Yes, the voice is really important to me, because I think, I mean, there's a lot written about oral histories and so on, but a voice really tells a lot. So it's not just the words, obviously, and that give us a lot of information about education and so on, and where you're brought up and so on, but also the way you say things, you know. So if your sort of throat tightens when you're talking about somebody, or if you pause, you know, it's those gaps as well as the speaking. Yes, it's a very rich thing for me, and that's why I really recommend people having a real variety of voices in their pieces, you know, so that you make sure you don't just interview older people, but also younger people, you know, and genders and so on. I think one reason, yeah, I need to think maybe a little bit more about what else about voice really attracts me, but something that's always attracted me to audio rather than film or video, even though I love film, is that people often feel much more relaxed when they're just being interviewed for audio, and so you get a much I'd say a much richer, often, I'm not saying always, but you can get a much richer, especially from people who aren't professionals, who are just normal people. You can get a much richer response to questions if it's radio, and if you manage to help them forget that they're being recorded. So I find audio much better like that, because people aren't caring about what they look like, or, you know, this, that, and the other. It just makes them feel more relaxed. So that's one reason I'd say is why the voice seems to say a lot more if it's just audio, and also because we listen more, because we haven't got those visual signals potentially. But I'll think about that more as well. It's really interesting. And then you were saying that you were wondering whether the term engagement would be better than embodiment. Yeah.
Not
right?
Not engagement, just whether you see a difference that's important or not.
Yeah, I mean,
because a Marvel film is engaging, for example.
Yes, and as you mentioned, you know, people can be very immersed in what they're doing, and it can end up being quite dangerous. I mean, that is actually a real problem with located media work. You have to think about that very carefully, because you don't want somebody getting run over or something. Yeah, engagement to me makes me think of both immersion and embodiment. So, you know, I guess I'm using those terms to sort of separate it out a bit, and I guess engagement means other things as well to me. I think embodiment for me is very important, because it's about there's something, so it's the kind of mention that it's a physical engagement, if you want to, and I think that's very important in locative media. It's your body is, for example, what I'd say in both places, your body is in the landscape and your body is in the digital story, exactly as we are when we answer a mobile phone. You know, we can often imagine we're with our friend that we're talking to on the phone. We're in that place as well as where we are in our own room. You know, so there's something going on there, and I'd say the body is very important for me, an embodiment. So I don't know if that answers you, but I'll definitely think more about it, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I'll think on it. Okay.
Julie, you want to?
Yes, I think just to respond to like the human scale and so on, and humanizing the experience and maps. I mean, I guess I want to take the question back to the COVID-19 context and, you know, social distancing, and how can we, and I think that then, you know, takes us back to Lucy's presentation and project, how would I do to translate an empathy walk into a not like a disembodied event? And I think the audio is probably the easiest answer as well. But I think what's really important with empathy walks is that all the senses need to be stimulated. So you've got the smell, you've got the touch, you see the person in front of you, and that's why it cannot be scaled up for loads of people. I'm also really interested in exploring how you could translate that back with an audio walk, for instance, like a map. You would have like a visual element and the embodied element where you walk the route, listening to a person's story. But just to give like a quick example of this kind of human dimension as well. Last year for the London Festival of Architecture, we did a series of it was like 4 walks where we divided our audience into 4 different like small groups, and each walk leader had a different impairment. So you would experience the built environment following their impairments. One was blind, one was an amputee cyclist, one was relying on a quite large electric wheelchair. It was really good to experience the city like that. And even though the walks didn't take place in the person's neighborhood, we had met beforehand and explored it together and traced the route together. And the audience, reacted really well. And there was a series of games as well of like, how can you experience this impairment yourself? For instance, with the blind walk leader, we had like people working in pairs and blindfolding themselves and letting the other one lead them through the street. So it's also this notion of being led, trusting the person next to you, and relying on your hearing, for instance, instead of your view. So there was, I don't know, it just made me feel like, with the senses, you can actually also, if you want to work on, for instance, just smell or audio, you could actually also invite people to try to do things blindfolded or put themselves into someone with an impairment. I thought that was quite an interesting way of doing a walk as well.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Julie. Right. So Andrew, got some thoughts?
Yeah, quite a lot of thoughts. I mean, just picking up really on what Julie and Lucy have been saying. I mean, it's interesting in the outputs I made in response to the pandemic and the walking that I was doing was that they're very visual, and I was conscious of that at the time. Even though I had made lots of sound recordings and video recordings, I didn't really develop those any further. But thinking really about the questions or the points that Jacob was making, they were quite poetic in the responses that you were making to what I was doing. You picked up on trajectories or lines of flight, and also thinking about the virus as a living entity. And I think as time has gone on, I have been thinking on those terms very much. In that, thinking about Doreen Massey's concept of space-time and trajectories of everything beyond on a trajectory. And if we think of everything as an object, and an object in terms of maybe Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, so the thing is the virus and the whole pandemic as an entity and an object in that sense, and that is on a trajectory, we start to think of it maybe in different ways, and that it's at the moment the world view is almost a very binary view of the virus, that once time it wasn't around and it was normal and we were doing all these great things, and then the virus was here, and at some point in the future it'll be gone again, and then so it's the virus here, virus gone, where the virus is the enemy. But actually it's a living thing, it's on the planet that we're sharing with, and it's doing its thing. It's going to evolve, it's going to become something else. It already is mutating. And maybe we should be, I think a lot of people are thinking about how we are living with it, and that we are all on these different trajectories, which are passing through this period of the pandemic, and that all those different trajectories have been affected by the fact that the virus is in play, and that our sense of the environment and our internal maps, they're completely rearranged because of this living entity that is now with us. And I think, but I can't remember whether it was Claire or yourself that made this point about how the collaborators that I worked with, how we responded to the pandemic and our walking, and they were, you know, to my mind, they were quite topographical. They were very matter of fact and deadpan about, well, this is what we saw. They were urban sketches, and I think maybe that, I don't know why that was particularly, but if I was to develop this work any further, I think it would take on these more poetic responses to this flow of time, the river, and I think we were all, in Frankwell here, we are conscious of this giant presence of Darwin that grew up here, and this is where his formative encounters with the natural world were. I've worked in the garden where he walked every day. It's now a bit of, it's quite rundown woodland right next to the river, and the Shropshire Wildlife Trust have done a project to try and reinvigorate that, and I do feel that presence, and it informs how people respond to this locality. Anyway, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think there is an evolution of this mapping process, which could become more poetic and bring all these entangled trajectories.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, it's interesting actually the way maps have been, and maps have had quite a strong rhetorical presence in the discourse around COVID-19, haven't they? And but they're usually epidemiological maps. I mean, they simply show the spatial distribution of recorded cases or deaths. They don't, well, they're of course, including our own initiative on mapping the pandemic and the Bloomberg one, have attempted to get to, if you like, more subjective ways of representing the impacts of it. But I think you're right. I think there's quite a lot of work that actually needs to be done. I think Jacob's got a line on that, really, in a way. And actor network theory can actually provide a kind of way of thinking around these issues, which is maybe a bit new for cartographers, but I think is probably going to run and run. Right, well, we've got about 15 minutes or so. There've been quite a lot of very interesting questions that have been flagged up on the, you know, on the chat. So I think we'll just sort of start with those. For example, Dr. Robert, is Dr. Robert with us? Yes, I think you are. You've put a question in there about the notion of empathy. So I suppose that's aimed at the Julie. And I think you had another question later on as well. So would you like to unmute yourself and just maybe put a few questions out there? Can you unmute? Yeah.
There we go. Am I unmute? Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great. So what brought me here today is that I teach online classes in technology and human values as an urban ethnographer. And we, of course, are doing all of our teaching and learning online, remotely. And so we're all dying from lack of interaction. So I am going to implement something that Elizabeth Chen has already been doing called Google Alongs. That's her term for using Google Street View to pair up students and then have them take turns taking each other around a familiar part of the city, which is unfamiliar to their partner, their student partner. And they take turns interviewing each other. But I need a product beyond just a boring print report. And your Livingmaps is speaking to me, but I haven't figured out how to piece together the nuts and bolts yet from to produce, have something like this result from students acquainting each other with an initially unfamiliar part of the city to the partner, you know, in turns. That's why I'm here. And if anybody has anything useful to say on this, I'd be very grateful.
Okay, thank you. Well, Lucy, I mean, you've got some thoughts on that, and Julie and Andrew, and anyone else actually, but maybe our three presenters first off.
I think you're on mute, Lucy.
Yeah, it all came out. Yeah, no, I was reading your comments and in the chat, and I found it very interesting, that idea. And I mean, there have been examples of work where people have done remote investigations together, but one of the earlier messages you made was just saying whether you could use whether you could use Google to connect people. And I think there's some great ideas there that we need to kind of think about what we can do, because we need to carry on making work, and we have to accept that the sort of global situation at the moment, and we want to connect. I mean, there's a lot of work where, in fact, Blake, who's here, should maybe talk about that, like where where people walk in different cities at the same time and share sort of feedback and so on. I know Blake's had a really long history of that. And so I think we're all looking for ways of engaging people, and how to communicate with people, and how to walk with people or at the same time as people.
If Robert was to get hold of your app, would he be able to use that for what he wants?
Well, this is interesting, and in fact, Richard White, who also makes apps,
yes,
has made a comment about this in the chat, about the decay of these things. So actually, so Richard White and I, and probably some other people here, used App Furnace, this really great platform, app making toolkit by Calvium. But actually, I think it was a year or two they stopped running it, you know. And so Richard was asking me what I use now, and at the moment I'm exploring, after doing other stuff, slightly not with apps, I'm now exploring again the tools that are already out there to try and use, because a lot of us end up trying to develop something from zero, and I think that's sort of pointless at the moment, especially if you just want to make the work, that your concentration is on the work rather than coding. And there are a lot of apps out there. So yeah, if anyone knows of any other platforms, then do tell us in the chat, and Richard, I'll keep you in contact with that. But yeah, so basically the quick answer is you cannot do the Hail Churks app right now, because the platform that it was on no longer supports it, and is no longer there. And there is a big issue of what happens to these pieces of work, the technology. So, in the last issue of Livingmaps journal, you had a thing about the issues with linked. A lot of us have issues with our apps. It's a long-standing issue, a problem, and that's why some people like me go back to MP3 sound walks, because we know we can make them work anywhere.
Richard, do you want to come in and just add a comment there?
Yeah, Lucy's picked up on the kind of the part of the substance of it, but I was sort of extending that. I think there is a real issue. There's a lot of wonderful work that just died when App Furnace went down, was taken down. It didn't kind of go down all by itself. But what that kind of raises is then the questions of putting a lot of effort into acquiring assets, developing assets, talking to people, interviewing, making soundscapes, and all of that. That's maybe part of a funded project, so you can have a wonderful spectacle. So you mentioned Duncan Speakman. Duncan Speakman has done the most amazing things but they're very much kind of like one-off events. Whereas it seems to me that what we're talking about is about, you know, it's developing participation, building community, deep mapping a place, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So in my practice, what I found was at the very moment that you kind of publish something, it kind of almost stimulates even more demand for participation at the very point where it kind of closes down. And so I was sort of interested in, so, you know, particularly at the moment where we can't do walks together, so there's a real demand for that remote delivery of stuff. You know, how you know, what are people's thoughts on how do you gather and publish that whilst retaining some sort of liveness, some sort of sense of participation? I don't have any answers. It's a kind of a question out there. So it's a kind of this, what I was exploring is a question of digital inclusion. So if we go towards producing stuff that's on smart devices, well, what about the people who haven't got smart devices? So that hence that's not a jibe, Lucy, but that kind of digital gentrification that kind of goes on, that you can only do it if you've got the latest iPhone. But also
that's why MP3, going back to MP3s is often
go back to old technology.
Even though not everyone has access to that, but more people do. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, because we're running short of time, I'm just going to read out a couple of questions in the chat, which seem to me to be very interesting and could do with some discussion. I mean, one is from Julie Chamberlain, who says, particularly in relation to Julie's presentation, that she has such mixed feelings about working to make undervalued people and spaces legible to planners. It feels like there are some risks and downsides there. So, for example, you know, the whole issue of, which I found as an urban ethnographer, you know, people kind of tell you stuff about what they're up to, but they don't necessarily want, you know, the authorities to know about it, and they're, you know, a bit squeamish about, you know, having any information about it at all, because, you know, it could be illegal, or it could be just they just don't want to be, they don't want to be on the map, right? So how do we deal with that?
I just wanted to double check that. Was that the risk identified by the person? Because
well, she didn't say what the risks were, but are there risks and downsides to?
Well, yes, I think definitely, and it's, you know, it's sort of about the relationship that you build with the walk leader, I think, and making sure so that, you know, they also own the information that's out there. So the idea that the project is open source is very much that the methodology and the support that the Empathy Walks team can offer for people who want to organize empathy walks is out there. But I think that the walk leader needs to be fully comfortable about the level of publicity and who would come to the walks and so on. I think there's a tacit agreement which, I mean, it's based on, I guess, personal judgment. But, you know, I wouldn't force anyone to add something on a map when they don't feel comfortable doing it. I think generally through the interview, walk leaders end up thinking that this is actually something worth discussing. This is actually something worth fighting for. So no, I guess it's very ad hoc for that situation, but I haven't actually come across this case yet. But if you have an example in mind, I'd be interested.
Right. Okay. Something to think about. There's a question about from Nick Hall. Is Nick Hall still with us? Well, if not, I'll basically.
Yes, he is.
Oh, he is. Okay. So please unmute yourself. There you are. Good.
Hello. Yes. Sorry about that. Yes, I was just fascinated. I haven't been involved in Livingmaps work at all, and I'd only been involved from a practical point of view from my career in humanitarian disasters, which I've ended a few years ago, although I still live in a pandemic now, overseas. And we used I was working with children, and we developed a whole series of techniques to involve children in mapping their local area, knowing that they knew their neighborhood better than anybody, really, kids do, and digitalize those maps often, which was a problem sometimes, because if you set them in any sort of stone, even a digital map can be a problem. And then I remember looking at a digital map of a school, a digitized map of a school that the children had mapped for all the hazards and risks in the area. And when they set up a false alarm and everybody rushed off, I went in the wrong direction because I followed an ancient exit sign, not knowing that it was actually down a very, very, very steep hill. Nearly broke a leg. And the kids said, well, that was your fault. You should have been able to read the Spanish. Said, don't go this way. They'd updated the map because, but they hadn't taken that off because they thought that the children's sign was so beautifully inscribed. They left it up. So mapping and children and disasters has been my career really recently, and it's fascinating. So I'm really enjoying this session too. There's a great history in that. Well, not history, recent history, children and climate change and disasters. Thank you for inviting me in.
I've got a feeling of an article for our journal there, Nick.
Possibly, yes. I'll have a look at it. This has been an inspiration to me. Yeah. Although, as I say, I've been involved in this for many years.
Yes,
in different ways. I'm
sure we'd be interested in an account of of that work actually, because it is, as you say, very relevant to the current,
we did. We mapped.
Situation.
We got a group of children in El Salvador to map their village and come up with the different hazards. And they said dengue fever was the thing that killed people more often than anything. And then they worked out how to. They mapped the whole village, and then they went round the whole village and got all the standing water removed. People emptying buckets and things which lay around, and stopped dengue fever that year. They took advice from the public health officials as well. So they used their maps actively to reduce disaster risks. And that village had no dengue that year.
Right. Well, there's a long history there. With one of the most famous maps was about an outbreak of cholera in London, wasn't it?
Indeed. In the booth maps, yes.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think we more or less run out of time now. This is anybody who's really dying to say something. I mean, I think we've had a really rich set of contributions from our presenters, and also some very thought-provoking questions from our two discussants, other contributions. So I think it probably just remains now just to thank everybody, our presenters, our discussants, and of course everyone who's come in to take part in this. We're continuing this series in the new year. We have an event lined up about environmental issues, particularly about wildfires. I'm not quite sure when that's going to be. Sometime in January, we're hoping, and then there's another. The series goes on basically, and so we hope you'll join us. You can check it out on our website, which I think you should all know about, www.livingmaps.org.uk. So keep in touch with that, and I think it just remains to wish you all the best of a rather dodgy festive season, and to stay safe. And I hope we'll see a lot of you in January. And in the meantime, stay safe and have fun. So say bye for now.
Thank you, Phil, for organizing.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye for now.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, Claire. Bye.
Bye.